Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of Stump the DPE. I'm Jim Pittman, your host, and co-host today. I've got my good friend and fellow pilot, Russ Gill, helping us out. Go ahead and say hi, Russ.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you're at.
Very good. Appreciate you being here to help field the questions. And thank you to all you who are joining us live. One of the main reasons we're doing this is to have something social that we can do in these unusual times. And doing this live is a way to get out of our comfort zone and talk to each other and just talk about airplanes. So thank you for being here. If you do have a question or a topic you'd like to discuss, go ahead and put it in the chat box. If this is your first time, you should see that down on the Zoom controls. You can just put in a message to Russ. Let him know that you have a question or a topic, and then he can unmute you, and we'd love to have you ask the question yourself. If you're camera shy or don't have a microphone, you're welcome to go ahead and just type your question in and Russ can read it. So with that, I actually want to start today by going back to the last episode. The topic of pulse oximeters came up, and I did not go back to check exactly what I said. I do remember, or at least I usually, when I talk about those, I mentioned that there's a lot of variables and it's not the only thing you should be putting your trust in as far as whether you're hypoxic or not. But I may have oversold it a little bit because Sonia sent me an email, and I appreciate her doing that. In fact, Russ, go ahead and unmute Sonia. And Sonia is a medical doctor, so, as well as a pilot. So she sent me a quick email with a few facts, some of which I was aware of, some of which I was not. And so I invited her to go ahead and start off today. Maybe tell us a little bit about the type of medicine that you practice, Sonia, and then tell us what you know about pulse oximeters and, you know, pros and cons and kind of things we should be considering.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for this. And it's, so I'm a medical doctor. My training is internal medicine and nephrology, which is by no means the expert field when it comes to pulmonary physiology and exchange of gases and things that are related from a mechanical point to pulse oximetry. But it's a subject that's very dear to me, not just from a medical point of view, but also for what I do otherwise. I love to do things that are related to how the body processes oxygen, both occasionally climbing a mountain and doing free diving and other activities. So it's something that I'm very interested about. So as a disclaimer, I'm not the #1 professional to give advice, and I don't think you oversold the pulse ox. It's more of a matter of a word of caution. Because I think that people tend to over-rely on it. Same as with other technologies, there are always caveats and always things to consider. And pretty much the way pulse ox works is by using light, so it's spectrophotometry, and it sends out 2 wavelengths. One measures the hemoglobin that has oxygen, which is the one that you want in the body so that the tissues can get it. And the other wavelength measures the hemoglobin that does not have oxygen. And then it compares those two and calculates how much oxygen is in the tissues. Now it's measuring it at the finger or somewhere that's not the same tissues that you want to measure as a primary source. So you want to know what's going on in the lungs, in the heart, in the brain, things that are critical. So something that's in the finger is very far away from those other organs. So there's a delay, and it does not always correspond in numbers. And the delay can be quite significant. Sometimes it can be a minute or more, or over 100 seconds as well. So that's something to bear in mind. The other thing is that the way oxygen, I don't want to get all technical with it, but the body has this amazing capacity where hemoglobin, which is what carries the oxygen, in certain conditions will hold on to oxygen strongly. And it does that so that it can carry more of it. And then when the conditions change, for example, pH changes, a few other things, gases, then the curve all of a sudden switches to the opposite, and the hemoglobin wants to get rid of the oxygen. And that's done so that when the blood gets to the tissues can absorb more of the oxygen. So just to try to make it as efficient as possible. It's a really neat mechanism.
Oh, there we go. We were getting some background noise. They just muted out. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Yeah, no problem. So the body's built in such a way that it's maximizing this efficiency. But if you're working somewhere that's on the side of the curve where hemoglobin likes to catch more oxygen, you might not see much of a difference. If it's from 100 to 80, you're still working on that side. So even though there's a difference, you're not going to notice the difference in the numbers from the pulse ox. And now all of a sudden, if you start with somebody who maybe has a little bit of heart problems, a little bit of lung problems, that difference between having really good environment and being able to take up a lot of oxygen and all of a sudden being at altitude has much more of an effect. So one of the things to consider is that what matters most with pulse ox is a trend, not so much the number itself. And there's no consensus as to what number is a normal. So what that means is you go up to 8,000 feet, you're curious what your number is. What if you put on the all pulse ox and it reads 92? Well, if you're feeling fine, are you going to use oxygen? Are you going to dismiss it? Just because you feel fine doesn't necessarily mean that you're functioning well. As the video with the high altitude chamber was showing very well, this is something that comes on insidiously. And most people that have hypoxic, start having hypoxic or hypoxemic symptoms don't realize it. So that's where the danger lies at. And what if the pulse ox shows 98? Does that mean that everything's fine? Also, what if the pulse ox shows 98? Maybe you're at 5,000 feet, you have some headaches, you're feeling a little bit tired, you don't know if it's just because of dehydration, maybe you didn't sleep well last night. Well, is it actually a true number? Can you rely on it? So there are a lot of factors that go into that. Specifically, things that can affect the reading itself is it's peripheral, so you're going to have some delay. It also goes through the tissues, so if it's not closely to the skin and light gets in from the side, you can get false readings. The mechanism itself is not always working and reliable, so you need to make sure you get a good wave with it. Other things, probably not as much for you, well, not from either, but nail polish and skin color can also affect it. Also cold, because then the blood vessels are much more tight and constricted, so you're not getting as much blood flow. All of these things factor in. So it's a very imperfect way of measuring it. That's why trend is more important than the number itself.
Couple questions. Is it true that if someone has carbon monoxide poisoning, the hemoglobin will show a high number as if it was oxygen, like it can't tell the difference?
Yes, so that's all the ones I mentioned so far. All of those are the ones that would give you false negative, meaning that most likely the reading you're going to get is lower than what you would get if you measure blood gases by different methods. On the other spectrum is, so you have three different versions: oxyhemoglobin, which is hemoglobin with oxygen. The second one is deoxyhemoglobin, which is oxygen that does not have oxygen on it. And then you have carboxyhemoglobin, which is what you get when you get carbon monoxide poisoning. The carboxyhemoglobin and the oxyhemoglobin read on very similar wavelengths, meaning that if you have hemoglobin with oxygen or hemoglobin with side products of carbon monoxide, the meter cannot differentiate it between both. So it's going to give you a normal reading when in fact the body might be getting much, much less oxygen. Mm-hmm. So that comes into those cases where somebody may be going up and feeling a little bit headachy, maybe a little bit more tired than usual, not really sure what's going on, maybe didn't sleep well, maybe it's fatigue or something else, but it have to bear in mind that even if you get numbers that are 98, 99, carbon monoxide poisoning will not show up with the pulse oximeters. So it's an additional, I mean, my 2 cents are, and this is just opinion, is that it's a useful tool. It has its specific settings where it's easy access, it's non-invasive, it's relatively cheap, so it has its value. But it does need to be taken with precaution because the numbers have to be interpreted with caution. There are extremes and a lot of situations where the number does not correspond with what's actually going on in the body. And it can give you both false positives and false negatives.
Very good.
May I ask a question related to this, a follow-up question?
Please.
So one thing that, Sonia, that's fascinating. Thank you. And one of the things that I did not know that about that relationship between carbon monoxide and hypoxia relative to an oximeter. So that being said, when aviation outfits try and sell us an oximeter, that's only good for straight hypoxia. That's not good for us to determine we're having carbon monoxide poisoning, right?
Correct. Yes.
So here's a question for you. Are the symptoms of hypoxia that similar to the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning for an individual? The reason, for me, for example, having done the altitude chamber, I know that I get tunnel vision in hypoxia. So even climbing a mountain, if I get some tunnel vision, I know I'm getting some hypoxia. Would I get a similar physiological reaction from carbon monoxide poisoning?
Most likely, yes. And I would have to look at more literature and studies to see if anybody looked at the symptoms, comparing them side to side, which would be very difficult because nobody's going to expose people to carbon monoxide on purpose to get results. So a little bit of an ethical dilemma there. But if you think of it in terms of the two components that cause symptoms, so it's not like diving where you're holding your free diving, what I do, where you hold your breath. What gives people the urge to drive is the carbon dioxide buildup, not the lack of oxygen. So in both the carbon monoxide and high altitude, you have the same situation where the body gets rid of carbon dioxide just fine. So you're not going to have extra urge for breathing. But on the other hand, you're not going to have as much oxygen available to the tissues. And the ways the body senses that, there's some slight differences in terms of pH and how mechanisms compensate for that. The ways to compensate for differences in breathing CO2 and oxygen is with the lungs and the kidneys, but then also blood vessel constriction, different parts of the body. So there's a lot of overlap. The timing may be different. The duration is definitely different because carbon monoxide does not just reverse to normal. Once you stop the exposure, it stays around and it holds on the hemoglobin for a long time. And there's a really good episode on the Safety Institute, the There Was, the podcast. One of them is about carbon monoxide. And I apologize, I forget the names, but one of the dangers is that you do one short flight, you might get a little bit of symptoms. If you do a leg and then you do another leg, those effects are cumulative with carbon monoxide poisoning. You do not get that with high altitude. As soon as you reverse and you breathe in extra oxygen or extra pressure air, that responds pretty quickly.
So to follow up on that, someone like me, I carry an oxygen bottle on some flights because I fly out of this very high elevation place. So we're up sometimes flying at 12,000 or above. So if I got the symptoms of hypoxia and then I took a swig of oxygen and it had little effect or no effect, that would suggest carbon monoxide poisoning. Is that a safe assumption?
It could. It'll probably take me a little bit of thinking about that to see if there are any other situations.
In other words,
that might be the easiest way of differentiate.
Right, because the oxygen does not displace carbon monoxide, right? That's part of the problem of carbon monoxide poisoning. And so I've often wondered how to separate those two things. Now, I don't have a pulse oximeter, but I'm realizing that also, if I showed symptoms of hypoxia, but the oximeter showed consistently that I was oxygenating fine, that would suggest maybe carbon monoxide poisoning, and I should check that.
Yes.
I mean, I know I'm going off the scale, but this is a relationship I wasn't aware of. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. I'll look into that and I'll see what I can find as well, because one way or the other, what I would really, and that really changed for myself too. I'm still fairly new to aviation. First flight that I took with a friend at higher altitude, he said, "Do you want some oxygen?" And at first I was, "No, I'm healthy, I'm young, I don't need it." But after several months and studying and reading and additional things, I would suggest to everybody, don't try to be a champ and don't try to be the healthy, tough person. Just use that oxygen if you have it, because you don't know if the symptoms are going to come on without you realizing it, and you might get yourself into trouble that can easily be avoided.
Yeah, I never fly at night or on instruments over 10,000 feet without using it, because I've learned that my thinking gets sloppy way before I have other symptoms. So you're more likely to make a big mistake. And the other really interesting thing to try, and maybe you tried it, if you're flying at night at even 5,000 feet, and then you take a swig of oxygen, you will suddenly see 2 or 3 times the number of lights that you saw without it. It's truly illuminating, right? to do that. I would encourage everyone to try that sometime, and it just gives you an idea of how much, your senses are diminished when you're not getting enough. But thank you so much. I just learned something. I don't know if excited is the right word, but I'm really pleased to learn about this. Yeah,
thanks for giving me the chance to bring this up.
You're welcome. Thank you both. So disclaimers noted. We pretty much established that on these episodes, everything is just our opinion until we actually show an official reference. So you're in a safe place. But thank you for the insights from the doctor's point of view. It's probably oversimplified, but part of what I was wondering also that you guys just talked about is the way it was explained to me once upon a time, and I don't know, I probably give John and Martha King the credit for this one. I really don't remember where I first heard it, but I think of the hemoglobin as an empty bus, and it picks up the oxygen molecules and delivers it to the organs in the body. And one of the problems with carbon monoxide poisoning is the carbon monoxide gets on the bus much more easily. I forget what they say. It's like, I don't even remember the number, but you think of like a bully at a bus stop pushing the oxygen out of the way. The carbon monoxide jumps on the bus, fills up the bus, and then the oxygen can't get on. So it doesn't matter if you're inhaling 100% oxygen. If you've got carbon monoxide poisoning, the hemoglobin's already full, the bus is full, and therefore you are hypoxic, even though there's plenty of oxygen there. So and then what we're discussing is the pulse oximeter is just saying, is the bus full or is the bus not full? It doesn't really know whether there's oxygen on the bus or carbon monoxide on the bus. So is that all? I mean, I know that's very simplified, but does that fit, Sonia, with what we were talking about? Kind of think of it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. There's 2 ways that the oxygen gets carried in the body. One is dissolved in the blood, which is not very efficient. That's just passive, coming and going. And the other way is the buses, which is the hemoglobin. And that's a much better way of delivering oxygen to the tissues. And yes, carbon monoxide is what we call a much stronger affinity for hemoglobin, which is the way of getting on the bus easier and then sticking around for much longer, so it doesn't let the oxygen get there. And since both the carboxyhemoglobin, so the bus with the carbon monoxide, and the oxyhemoglobin, which is the buses with the oxygen, from the outside they look similar, meaning that you're not going to get the blue color, the cyanosis that you normally get when you have low oxygen levels for other reasons. And the other thing is you also still have oxygen dissolved in the blood. That doesn't go away, but that just does not deliver as much oxygen to the tissues as the hemoglobin does.
Very good. So, and also wanted to mention to your point, Greg, a good question about, will the supplemental oxygen be an indicator of whether I've got carbon monoxide poisoning or not? I would just recommend, let's all take a step back and ask, does it matter? Meaning at that moment, you're taking the oxygen, you're saying, man, I really don't feel better. At that moment, whether you have carbon monoxide poisoning or not, doesn't really matter. You need to get on the ground, get to a hospital, and let them tell you whether you have carbon monoxide poisoning. So, and I know you know that. I just wanted to point out that, we shouldn't stay up there at whatever altitude, sucking on oxygen, saying, yeah, I still don't feel good. I wonder. It's like,
well, the key thing the takeaway for me is this: if I'm suffering from hypoxia, one option is if I've got oxygen, it's going to help me, right? Mm-hmm. And or maybe I head for lower terrain so I can descend. But if I understand correctly, if I have carbon monoxide poisoning, then that's not going to help me probably. One thing I want to do is get some windows open and get airflow coming through there but I'll be impaired for a while after that. Right? So So I think there's a little difference, but the effect at that moment, I don't want to leave the status quo, is what you're saying, right? And I agree with you.
So I'm going to
Well,
share my screen. Go ahead, James.
I recently researched FAA safety evaluation of the pilot that wakes up in the field, who actually his plane actually landed in the field while he was unconscious. And the case was, I think, out of the Minneapolis area, and this guy had flown to a destination that was not that far away. He'd flown then to another destination and then was heading home and ended up waking up in the field, right? And so the FAA was very adamant about his input into this subject area, because like they said, there aren't that many people that survived this. Mm-hmm. And what it ended up being was, you know, he had started seeing the symptoms, you know, a light headache and a little bit of confusion. And as the day progressed through his flight path, it became more aware to him that there was a problem. But once he'd gotten to the point of no return, he just blanked out and woke up in the hospital, or woke up in the field. And then in the hospital, they told him how severely he actually had the carbon monoxide poisoning, and he was attributing it to, you know, maybe some like, you know, hypoxia. But the end result was that he very nearly did not survive that incident, and he was attributing it to, you know, just normal everyday things. Maybe he didn't eat, maybe he didn't drink, and it was quite the outcome. I think it's available on YouTube, Greg, if you want to check that out, because it was really insightful to me, having gone through the altitude chamber recently myself.
Thank you.
I'm actually looking it up. So you guys see my eyes darting all over the place. I was listening. Thank you. So there's a couple places you can find his story, and let's see, I think I've got it here. So I'm gonna show you that in a minute. Trying to remember his name, because I've heard him tell the story on a couple different occasions, but I apologize to the name of the pilot. I'm not remembering it right now. But first things first, let me share my screen. And, you know, we always want to make this educational. So let me pull this up. Okay, you guys should be seeing that now. So I just did a quick search for carbon monoxide sensors, and this is what you want to have, Greg, is if you are in that situation where you're like, gee, I wonder, be able to have a good carbon monoxide sensor that you can look at and see what it's sensing in your cockpit. This SensorCon one is one of the better ones. So they talk about this in the podcast I'm going to show you, that you can go listen to and hear that whole story right from the pilot that it happened to. But one of the things that he points out is you can go down to Home Depot and get carbon monoxide sensors for cheap, or Lowe's or anywhere like that. The problem is that they are purposely not sensitive enough because they don't want false positives, is that the right way, or a false negative. So that's not good for the cockpit. You need to pay at least $100. You guys all know there's only one cheap thing in aviation, and that's the pilots. So yes, that's an investment, and they are only good for a few years. The actual sensors do wear out. They have an expiration date. So watch the expiration date. But I think after you listen to these podcasts, you'll be a believer. So he was recently on In the Hangar. You can go on YouTube, search for In the Hangar, and look for it there. If you just type in the Hangar hypoxia, it'll probably come up. I first heard the interview on Max Trescott's podcast, and Max did something fun by actually putting his podcast on YouTube. And you might say, well, why would you want a podcast on YouTube? There's no picture to look at. And I, for one, am thankful he's doing it because it makes it easy to share the episodes. So when I listen to a great episode, I can blast it out to my own flight training clients. What I did is actually, if you go to my YouTube channel, FlywithJim.com is the actual name of my YouTube channel. and go down to my playlist, I actually put a playlist together called Carbon Monoxide Poisoning, and it has 4 videos in it. Keeping in mind that 3 of them are a podcast that you just listened to. The 4th one is the In the Hangar I was just talking about. So let me go to theirs. So there's our pilot. He's our hero. Or maybe we should call it the Miracle Man. He was unconscious when it landed. He did talk about the fact that he did log the landing. So, where's his name?
Sonia provided it. I believe she said it's Dan Bass.
That sounds familiar. Dan Bass. There it is, Dan. So thank you, Sonia. So there it is right there, Dan Bass. So I recommend that you guys go and listen and watch all 4 of these. And the first 3 are all Max Trescott, and then the last one is the In the Hangar. So it's a little playlist that I put together. For those of you who are here live, one of the benefits of being live is I can copy this. This is actually the playlist link. And then I have to find where my chat went. And I'm just going to give it to you guys live. And I'll put it, for everyone watching the recording, this will be in the description of the YouTube video when I put it on YouTube. All right, boom. So that should go to everyone. Okay, so good information there. Amazing story. You will be a believer in carbon monoxide detectors after this. I immediately ordered one. And that's that. So I also wanted to show you this. A lot of people are like, what do you mean supplemental oxygen? My airplane doesn't have that. You can actually buy these little canisters that go in your flight bag. And there's a few different kinds. This is the one that I carry. Let me just go to images here. My Caravan client, he has a bigger canister. His is more like this. Not quite the same brand, but it's not just for aviation. These are great to have in your flight bag. If you ever are flying along, whether it's day, night, doesn't matter the altitude, you start getting that headache. Maybe your person sitting next to you tells you your lips are turning blue. The first thing you should do is take a puff of oxygen and then consider landing. But anyway, so that's just a recommendation. Go look for, I think I just Googled portable oxygen canister. And I wanted to mention, well, that Caravan, you know, is unpressurized. So we've done some experimenting, I guess you could say, with my pulse oximeter. Typically, you know, so Caravan is kind of a strange animal where it's a turboprop, but it's not pressurized. And what that means is for the engine, you want to fly as high as possible, because the higher you fly, the more efficient the turbine engine is. But for oxygen reasons, you want to fly as low as possible so you don't use up your tank of oxygen too quick. So usually we're cruising somewhere between 9,000 and 12,000 feet flying the Caravan. And after being up there for more than an hour, we're like, well, hey, let's see the difference. So Sonia, you talked about the lag because we're putting the sensor on our finger. Yes, there is a lag, but I got to tell you, just from my own little experiment, it's only a few seconds, meaning I would be, you know, up there looking at a number like 88 or 89 and with the meter on my finger, and then I would put on the oxygen that's built into the Caravan, and within 2 or 3 breaths, just a few seconds, my number would jump up to 96. So it's amazing to me that they can do that with light through my finger and actually you know, have a reading that changes. But as Sonia talked about, that's only one factor. You got to be careful with that. But it just shows you how quickly breathing 100% oxygen gets into your blood when you're healthy anyway. And that's with no carbon monoxide poisoning. So let's see, I'm done with the YouTube. I also did a quick search. So I just opened my web browser and typed in FAA types of hypoxia. And I got 3 windows open here. One is right on the FAA website, some training website. They go through and talk about them here. So there's, oh, the other reference is the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. And then this looks like a flyer or handout. So hypoxic, hypoxia, hypemic, stagnant, and histotoxic. One of the most popular questions that we've had on these Stump the DP sessions is, how well do I have to know something for the check ride? And my answer is always, it depends. It depends on the scenario. And knowing the types of hypoxia is kind of like the one we talked about several episodes ago about knowing the types of fog. It's wonderful when the applicant knows the names. It's even more wonderful when they can apply it in a real life scenario. in all 4 types of hypoxia, all that really matters is your vital organs like your brain, your eyes, your heart. 1 or more of them are hypoxic. They don't have enough oxygen. It doesn't really matter whether it was because you drank alcohol or whether it was because you weren't moving around, that's stagnant. The alcohol is hypemic. Or whether it's because you're in a low pressure being at a high altitude, which is the hypoxia. Let's see, which one did I miss? And then, well, hypemic is like carbon monoxide poisoning. Histotoxic is the alcohol. I think I said that one wrong. And then stagnant is if you're not moving, like your toes go numb because you're sitting on an airliner for too long. That's stagnant hypoxia in your feet. Doesn't mean your whole body's hypoxic. It just means that those limbs are hypoxic, static hypoxia. Anyway, for a private pilot, I just speaking for myself as a DP, I'm not that worried that they remember all the names. It's nice if they know it, but I definitely want them to understand that there's different ways that your body can become hypoxic. And in real life, there's a compound effect where if you're really not healthy and maybe it was right at 8.5 hours ago, you had alcohol before you flew and you're going to a high altitude and it's at night, so your eyes need more oxygen to be effective with the rods. There's a whole bunch of factors that I would hope that even a private pilot applicant would be able to understand there. At the commercial level, I pretty much expect people can rattle these off and explain them and understand them in a scenario. So these were just the first few links when I typed in FA types of hypoxia. So they all look excellent, at least these first 2. So there's some study material for you guys. So, all right, good discussion. Thank you again, Sonia.
And Jim, before we move on to the next topic, Sonia did have one more comment on the lag time of oxygen in the blood.
Please.
Yeah, I was just commenting quickly. You're absolutely right. It comes back really quickly when you either inhale pressurized air or high oxygen to deliver it. But there's much more of a lag, and the lag that I mentioned with the drop of up to 100 seconds, it's on the decrease side. So you can also measure it if you hold your breath, keep holding your breath, you don't see the drop off until fairly advanced into the whole process.
Interesting. So when you do the diving, like how long do you typically hold your breath? I'm just curious.
Well, there's not really typically. I'm working on it. Right now I'm at about 3 minutes for static, which is static without diving. And same as with any other activity and things, I incorporate different amounts of safety margins depending on the environment. For example, here in Oregon, where the visibility on a good day is 6 feet, so most times you can't even see the tip of your fins, I'm going to be much more conservative and not dive past maybe 40 seconds, even when I'm spearfishing, because they're not going to be able to see you if you have some kind of event or issue if you're underwater, and you always buddy up with somebody. When it's clear water, there are tons of people that are helping in training, or we're doing line dives or other things, then that's a different scenario. So it really varies from one to the other.
Very cool. I think that's awesome. Definitely on my bucket list. So
it's worth it.
All right. Well, Russ, thank you again for helping watch the chat. What else we got coming in?
Well, we've got someone ready to stump the DPE.
Oh boy.
James Burnett is ready. He's ready, loaded, and so we'll turn it over. James,
bring it on.
Okay, so I got the opportunity to get some time in a Redbird FMX AATD, and I took the advice of somebody that I thought knew the answer and ended up messing up my logbook a little bit. I do not have the letter from the FAA spelling out the authorization of the simulator. So what can I and what can't I log in terms of simulator time?
So give me a specific scenario that you think you got bad advice on.
Yeah, so landings, cross-country time, and I knew that the answer on PIC and total time was a negative. Okay. But it was the in-between things, you know. I know that if it was IFR, I could log, you know, simulator IFR simulated time, but it's more about the ancillary things that you log in your logbook, and I've done my research already now, so I think I know the answer, but.
No, that's a good one. And it was either the last episode or the episode before we did talk about this a little bit. So this will be a good follow-up conversation. Let's start big picture. This might not seem that important to some of you, but I don't know, I guess it's just a pet peeve. It really bothers me when someone says, you can't log that. The reality is it's your logbook. The FAA does not have any rules that I'm aware of that tell you to not put something in your logbook. If you want to put in your logbook every time you go on a walk with your wife, go ahead, it's your logbook, okay? Now, that being said, there's certainly things that are not advisable to put in your logbook, or a better way to say it is, if you're not doing it in alignment with policy, then you're gonna have a difficult time when you get to an airline interview or a check ride, or any kind of interview for that matter, and you've got to prove that you are logging at least the minimum. So yes, there are certainly recommended procedures, but I don't know, it just kind of hits a nerve when someone tells me that I'm not allowed to log something. Part of that is because I also once upon a time had someone tell me to change my logbook, and they messed up my logbook, or I let them get me to mess up my logbook. That's probably a more responsible way to say it. And I want to tell you that story real quick. So, and this is probably what got me all fired up about other people telling me about my logbook. This one did not have to do with a simulator, so this is a quick tangent, but it has to do with logging PIC. And this is back, it was my CFI initial check ride, before I really understood the difference between acting as PIC and logging PIC. And this was January 1997. Since then, organizations like AOPA have written some really great articles that make it very clear. But basically, before I got my high performance endorsement in a 182, my instructor and I think we did like 7 or 8 hours in the 182. And somewhere in there, I was given the high performance endorsement. And I had logged PIC time, which is what my instructor had me do. And when I showed up to my CFI check ride, the examiner looked at my logbook, said, you can't log this as PIC. And right there in front of him, he basically insisted that I put in a correction line and take out that PIC time before I had the high performance endorsement, before he would continue with my check ride. So of course I wasn't going to argue with the guy. I'm like, oh yes, sir. So I put in a correction line, and it was months later that I really researched and figured out, even though I was not acting as the PIC before I got the endorsement, I was the sole manipulator of the controls in an aircraft in which I am rated. And the reference for that is 6151, logging pilot time. And again, there's no argument. I was not acting as PIC. My instructor sitting next to me was the PIC. But because, and there's been a letter of explanation from the FAA that an aircraft in which you are rated means either a type rating, if that applies, or category and class. So because I was a pilot, at the time I was probably private pilot, single engine land, it doesn't matter that the 182 is over 200 horsepower. Because I was the sole manipulator of the controls, I could log it as PIC, not act as PIC. So I put another correction line in my logbook, putting that time back in, because the fact is my instructor did nothing but talk, and I was the sole manipulator of the controls the whole time. So, all right, that's the tangent. Now let's talk about what you did. You guys should be seeing my screen. I've got my browser open here. So Redbird, one thing for you to know is it's actually right there in my my previous searches. So go to Google and type in Redbird FMX letter of authorization. And because Redbird is so popular and they're a good company that does well with communication, this is actually available right online. So you do need to make sure that the machine you're using falls within the description of this letter of authorization. But wherever the simulator's at, they are supposed to have this on display or readily available. I forget what the exact terminology is. So that's one thing, is you need to, if it's a flight school or a flying club, they should have their appropriate letter of authorization. But as far as I know, this, yeah, it's right there, LD, SD, FMX, and MCX. And this was just updated in January. So as long as the owner of the simulator, we use the term simulator generically there, the AATD, that you're talking about, as long as they've done all of the Redbird updates, meaning software updates, then this letter of authorization is what you're looking for. The another resource, I think his name's Josh. He did a webinar. Let me type in just webinar, Redbird webinar, see what comes up. And he specifically talked about this question of what you can log. In fact, there's probably Josh Harnagle. He's the guy. He's like vice president over marketing or something. Remember which one that was I watched. It was a good one a while ago. I think it was, no, that wasn't that long ago. Which way are these? These are in order? It was probably this one right here. Implementing, nah. Anyway, so lots of good stuff there. But let's go just look for Redbird how to log time. That looks good. Yeah, that's probably what we want. Logging on the right side of the law. So without even looking at this, I can tell you, you don't log the takeoffs and landings in any FTD, AATD, or basic ATD. So never log the takeoffs and landings. The cross-country time does not count in a simulator. And whether it was simulated IFR or not is whether you're physically wearing a view limiting device or you have the screen set to be in the clouds. Either of those you can log instrument time. And it gets a little tricky with certain paper logbooks because usually there's a column that just says something like pilot time. And it's usually under a bigger header that says flight conditions or something like that. You got to be careful with that because obviously a simulator, you're not flying anything. But when you get to something like commercial part 61, we talked about last time, 250 hours of pilot time is the requirement, and up to 50 hours in a machine like the Redbird counts towards that. So yeah, per the regs, it counts as a certain amount of piloting time, though it's not really flight time, but your logbook. This is one of the reasons I'm a big fan of electronic logbooks. It's if someone wants to have a paper logbook, that's great. I think it's worth the extra work to also put your time in an electronic logbook where you can create extra fields and really split these kinds of things up. I would recommend having a separate column if you have time in a basic ATD or AATD or an FTD, and then you go onto the airlines later and you're actually flying a full motion flight simulator. It would be smart to have all of those in separate columns because it's easy to add them together when you need the total, and it makes it so much easier when certain people only want to know about certain things. So did I answer it all? What did I miss?
Yeah, he says that he's nodding his head that he answered it all.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, so those are some good resources there. Google, yeah, comes up right in the first few links here. This will all be good stuff. So, all right, very good. What else we got, Russ?
Nothing else in the chat right now. Sonia said thanks for letting her participate. She has to sit in the background right now, but she wanted to thank you for that.
She's one of those medical people on the front line, still working hard. Thank you for that, Sonia. We appreciate you. All right. Well, anything you guys, any topics you want to finish up with? Anything that's been on your mind? Well, you said you wanted to brainstorm something. What was that, Russ?
I did. Before I do that, I didn't know if Brian Phillips, who had invited James to participate, didn't know if he's getting ready for a check ride, and this is a good opportunity to hear from a DPE or not. Didn't know if Brian wanted to add it.
I'm an open book. You can ask anything you want. I promise I'll make something up. So all right. Yeah, while we're waiting, if you do have something, please throw it in the chat. But you were asking something about flight clubs earlier, Russ, and you know, Greg, we're honored to have you here. Greg's been around the industry for quite a while, so he might have some observations and opinions to share. So go ahead with what you were asking about earlier.
So some legal issues specifically, and somewhere I thought that CFI part would come into play. Obviously, if you have a flying club, you probably want to have a CFI within the club that can perform check rides in whatever planes that you have available. Legal issues, I assume each state has different legal issues. Does the FAA mandate specific legal issues for starting a club? Can you start it from 2 or 3 friends saying, hey, let's put our 2 planes together and let's start a flying club?
So are you doing this from the context of joining an existing club, or are you thinking of actually starting one using your airplane as a club plane? What are you thinking?
Creating, starting from scratch, maybe picking one or two people to go into the club that may have a plane or two, different types of planes, and then start advertising for club members.
So I know AOPA has done some recent work with flying clubs. While I'm queuing that up, Greg, do you mind just chiming in with
Yeah,
observations of things you've seen good or bad over the years?
I would be glad to. A couple things I would recommend. First, AOPA does have a whole initiative on flying clubs. Bateman is the name of the fellow who's in charge of it. They also have, I believe, agreements, sample agreements that you can get, that you can download and have a look at. One thing I would strongly recommend is to identify some good clubs, because you're doing that, Jim. I'm trying to, Russ, is that your name that I'm speaking with here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, Russ, where are you located?
I'm in Phoenix. I belong, when I first got my pilot's license, I joined a flying club up in Minnesota, and it was by far one of the best I've ever seen.
Yeah, I was in 3 or 4 of them in the past, and they were fantastic. And they generally, when they've been around a while, they've come up with just really great rules and so on. So I would talk to the good folks in Minnesota, and I can provide some names, or else, I would talk to several clubs. That West Valley Flying Club that Jim is clicking on has a great reputation. Find out what their rules are. In fact, it may be as simple as going online and seeing, but so much of this has to do with setting up a functional set of rules that gives everyone the freedom. I've never run into any indication, I've never formed one, but I've never run into any indication that there's necessarily a state implication unless it's a for-profit club. And I believe in most cases, when you talk to the insurance people, I think you can also name approved instructors who are not club members to do training. So I don't think that and some clubs, any instructor can do it, but a big part of this would be to talk to an appropriate insurance broker to find out what they would require to protect the club and the, and if they have any instructor requirements they would like to see. So that would be my sequence of events. I'd talk to AOPA first and see what they've got, and then I would talk to some existing clubs that are effective. The payment structure is also a very interesting element of these things, because what you want to do is have it structured in a way that flying is very affordable. So, the traditional way to do this is that you would have fixed rates. Your monthly rate would pay the fixed cost for the airplane, like the hangar and the insurance. And then you obviously have the hourly rate for the direct costs. However, in some clubs I've been in, they actually would pad the fixed rates. They'd make the monthly rate a little on the high side so that they would get the hourly rates a little more on the low side. And then maybe have a minimum of a couple hours a month you have to pay for. But the intent was to get everybody out there flying, make it such a good deal that they would want to fly. And that, of course, lowers your operating expenses significantly if people fly quite a bit. So those are some of the tricks you can learn from an existing club that would be very valuable, in my opinion, as you set this up.
Very good. Thank you. That's perfect. Since you asked or mentioned legal, we have to, of course, give the disclaimer that none of us are attorneys, so we can't give legal advice, right? That being said, you saw me pulling up all that stuff. Let me go ahead and share that back. And Brian, glad you made it. How you doing, buddy?
Good. How are you?
Good. Everyone's still healthy at home?
Yes.
Very glad to hear it. Let's see that screen right there. So I remember hearing a podcast. Sure enough, it was our good friend Max Trescott. So if you go back to episode 97, that would be a good one to listen to again. I forget who he interviewed, but I remember thinking, wow, that was a lot of good information. Mark Epner, founder of Leading Edge Flying Club in Chicago. There you go. So episode 97 at aviationnewstalk.com, or just go to YouTube. Like I showed you, he's putting those episodes on YouTube as well. And then all the rest of this was AOPA. So I just searched AOPA Flying Club and bunches of good stuff came up. This page in particular is called Start a Flying Club. and it looks like they've pretty much got links. And I look at this as a list of variables, like things you should be considering. And many of them are what Greg just rattled off quite impressively. So there's great resources there. As an AOPA member, you can just call the toll-free number and say, hey, I'd like to talk to a specialist about flying, about starting a flying club. And they're probably going to tell you to go here first. So it'd be good to go read all this stuff first. And if you still have questions, call and tell them, hey, I read everything. Here's a few specific questions, or make sure I'm on track kind of thing. I'm guessing part of their legal services plan, for a little more money on your subscription, you could have access to actual attorneys. That would be a smart place to start with that. And then what else was I thinking? Oh, just to comment on what Greg was saying about the pricing structure. One club that I'm familiar with, it's an old Skyhawk that's $125 an hour wet, but the club dues, it's $250 a month for the club members, but that includes 2 flight hours for free. So basically, if you fly 2 or more flight hours a month, there are no dues. You're just paying the $125 an hour for the airplane, which is a creative way to keep everyone flying at least 2 hours a month. And of course, anyone who just wants to pay the $250 a month and not fly, that's just, gravy for the owner. But yeah, there's all kinds of little things like that, that's good advice. So any other specific questions on that, Russ?
No, I think you gave me a good jumping off point. Probably my purpose is doing exactly what Greg had mentioned, making it affordable for people to fly if they don't own their own plane or can't afford, regular rental rates. And so and plus, to be honest with you, wanting to be able to take longer trips with more people. And in my Mooney, you only fit so many people. So it would be nice to have a 150 or 152 in the club, obviously a complex, and maybe a 6 or something, just to have a variety. So I just thought that would be probably
that was one of the big benefits to the club I was in. I would never have bought an airplane had there been a club like that.
Right.
Moved to Phoenix, which was many years ago. But to be able to, we had a 210, a 182, and a 172 in the last club I was in Indiana. And it was fantastic to be able to grab the 172 for instrument currency or fly over to Kokomo for lunch or something, and then take the 210 to California, stuff that, to have those choices and based on the number of people who were going, just as you're observing, it was really a great setup. One other thing about the AOPA setup I wanted to mention, they may well have folks right there in Phoenix, Russ, who, like you, are interested in putting a club together. So they might have some contacts for you. So that's another reason
nice.
why I would talk with them on the chance that they actually know 6 other people who've contacted them about putting a club together.
Great, I will. And actually, it was someone that had been talking to Jim that reached out to me, and just I saw a comment that they had said something about a club. It says something I've been thinking about for a while, and I could tell you the name later, Jim, and I have to look it up. But I thought it was just through one of your connections, and they just responded to me today and said, I'm interested in talking about it. So I thought, well, I might as well start researching what would be the appropriate procedures to get started. We do have at least one more question, Jim, if you're still open for
good.
sticking
If
by.
anyone needs to go, don't feel bad. Just say bye or wave and go. There's no set time on these. It's kind of tradition now. We keep it close to an hour, but I'm happy to keep going as long as we got questions. What do you got?
All right. Well, I'm going to ask it for Brian. He's having some connectivity issues. He may be able to pop in if necessary, if he needs some clarification. But his question is, if the FAA sends a letter requesting medical records, you submit the requested medical records, and a year has passed with no further info, best way to get the status update at this point?
I believe in prayer.
I agree.
Oh man, Greg probably has more stories than I do on this, but any of us that have been around for more than a few years, we all know people that have really struggled dealing with medical issues with the FAA. It's a very imperfect system, and nothing, negative against the FAA. It's kind of a lot of it has to do with stuff that comes down from Congress. They only have so much control as an agency, and, the leadership management agency. There's all kinds of reasons why, but it is what it is. And the reality is, once your medical gets denied, it takes a lot of luck and prayer for you to get it done in a timely manner. So it sounds like if the FAA is asking for medical records, it's because someone has effectively failed their medical or been denied, whatever the proper terminology is, and they're trying to get what's it called, a special issuance. And that for some people it goes real quick. For other people it takes years, and careers have been ended for these reasons, or at least put on hold for many months, if not years. So I don't have any magic advice other than AOPA. That's my best quick advice to anyone who's having trouble with the FAA in any manner. They have a whole team that focuses on medical issues. If you're not already paying the $69 or whatever dollars it costs now to be an AOPA member, it's worth every penny for many reasons. So please be an AOPA member, at least the basic membership. As soon as you set that up, give them a phone call. And they are working remotely right now, but they've got it set up where they are working. So you might have to wait on hold a little longer than usual, but you should be able to call AOPA during their normal business hours. And if you've already done that, I'm sorry, I don't have any other advice for you. But Greg, what do you got?
Well, a couple things. First, AOPA has a second tier of medical coverage. You have to pay extra for it. I think it takes you up to $100 a year. But at least in normal times, they actually have someone located in the Oak City office. So we've had several cases. One individual in our group who had been waiting months and months and months and months. It doesn't matter where you are in your medical process. You can pay that money and ask them if this is available now during the COVID crisis. But they can actually check into the status of the records. So I have one individual in our group who had been waiting for 9 months and heard nothing. AOPA checked on it, and 2 weeks later they got the medical. So that was the best story I've ever heard from them. But I would definitely do that. Start with the regular medical people first and ask them if they recommend going to the higher level that is something that could be checked on. I have also heard good things regarding the FAA regional flight surgeon, like they're located around the country. Somebody I know contacted a regional flight surgeon of the FAA in San Francisco, which was their region, and this individual was able to look into it and find out what was going on. And then the third tip I would have, anytime anybody's got a medical problem that's going to mean dealing with the FAA, you're usually best to deal with someone to work with an AME who does a lot of airline physicals and does first class, because they usually have a direct line. They can phone the FAA. I've seen it done before. I've seen the AME phone at the FAA and say, I've got a guy here who has such and such a problem. I'd like to issue him his medical, even though this is sort of borderline. Is that okay? And he got a yes. This guy walked out the door with his medical. So, but those people work directly with the FAA all the time, whereas a lot of third class, not all of them, but a lot of third class medical people, it's a family doctor who maybe isn't even a pilot and doesn't have those contacts. And there are some people, one examiner that's widely, I've never worked with him, but everybody loves this, Dr. Bruce Chin, Chien, in Central Illinois. He'll do a teleconference with you, and he can, with tough medical problems, he's got a great reputation for helping people with tough medicals situations get through it. But again, the first class people, they're working with airline pilots whose jobs depend on this. They generally have a much bigger toolbox than someone who is just doing third class medicals in your local office.
Perfect.
So those would be the steps I'd recommend.
Great advice. I'm not going to bother sharing my screen, but when I Googled FAA regional flight surgeon, it comes right up. So anyone who wants to go get more contact information. Unfortunately, right now with everything going on with the coronavirus, there are not very many FAA employees actually going into the office. The ones that I work with are all working from home. So I imagine that's going to put a further delay on any kind of medical things that need to be done in Oak City, but I don't know. It's worth asking AOPA. Excellent advice, excellent tips, Greg, thank you. The only other thing that I think I'm on safe ground is to give general advice on this, and that is to realize there's a difference between going to the doctor and doing an FAA medical exam. And that online, video conference type conversation is the kind of thing you want to do, or even a face-to-face with a doctor that's not a medical exam, if you have any questions or concerns at all. If there's a medication that you've been taking, or if there's a condition that you've been diagnosed with from childhood, anything like that, Google it, with the word FAA in the Google search, see if it might be an issue, or if there's clear guidance already that it's not an issue, then you're probably okay. But trust me, it's worth the extra appointment or video conference to get those questions answered. Because like your example there, Greg, if they're actually in the official exam and that the answer to that phone call was no, you got to disapprove it, it's too late. You're screwed. They can't pretend that you weren't doing an official exam. The test has started. It's either pass or fail. So get those questions answered beforehand. Go ahead.
Well, this is a topic of great interest to me because I have seen so many people, they get started on their lessons and then they are getting close to solo, they're sent off to get the medical, and they just go there without any guidance ahead of time. So first of all, AOPA has something called the Turbo Medical that you can do online on their site, where you actually fill out the form and it will raise red flags.
There you go.
But the second thing that's worth doing for someone who, before they go for their medical, is to phone AOPA Medical and have a chat with them, and because they may identify some issues. Something as simple as having a letter from your doctor saying, Greg is on blood pressure medication and he's stable, no side effects. If you go in without the letter, it's going to the FAA. But if you go in with the letter, he gives you the medical and there's no more ever said about it. So you don't want to find that out at the medical. But here's another interim bit that goes along with what you're saying, Jim. Let's say I've got a condition that I'm concerned about that could be an issue. I don't want to find that out at the official medical. So I call a good AME. I say good, check references like you would with anybody. And I say, I would like to make a consultation appointment with you. I'm not booking a flight physical. I want to come in and talk about some things and find out what sort of paperwork you might need from me. You go in, you pay the fee, you talk to this individual, to this doctor, and find out what they think you need to have and do. Then you can go get that stuff and go back to that AME, right? Armed with what they need to issue the medical. And just to show how this can work, I had a little thing come up a few years ago where I was a little concerned about it. It was a minor thing, I thought, but who knows what's minor with the FAA. So I went online and filled out my the form, the online medical form that you have to do, but I didn't submit it. I just did that to do it, Then I went in to see the doctor and I said, hey, I'm having this issue. Do I need to worry about this? And he said, actually, no, this is a non-issue. You don't have to worry about it at all. Have you already filled out the form? And I said, yeah. He said, why don't you sign on my computer, submit the form, and we'll do your flight physical right now.
There you go.
And he did. But the key thing is, just as Jim has pointed out, you don't want to find this out once you have submitted the form and you're at the flight physical, because at that point, the doctor doesn't really have the option, doesn't have many options for sending you out for tests or other things he or she might need.
Yep. Very good. Perfect. That's excellent. And I think people have already picked up on this tip, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. Good reason to not wait until right before your first solo to go get the medical. Get it early, make sure there's no questions, and that's good advice. So cool. Well, yeah, we've definitely hit the 1 hour mark and then some. Anyone who needs to go, again, no hard feelings. Thank you for being here. Any final questions come in, Russ?
I have one more. I just real quick comment on that last discussion. As with every discussion here, it's amazing that you get the wealth of knowledge on these Stump the DPE broadcasts. So, I mean, I appreciate it. I mean, we're obviously able to tap into quality information from a lot of resources. Appreciate that. Did have one more question. If you're open to a time and a half of zero that you're getting paid for this.
I guarantee you this is all worth at least twice what you guys are paying. So.
Guaranteed. This is, and Dylan's going to ask me to read it from Dylan Kim. he had said that he wants to throw out a topic that's about yoke control during landing.
Okay.
And the CFIs on board may get their ears open. Especially, let's see here, especially pushing forward of yoke while soft field landing. After round out and seeing the plane sinking, the plane would touch down. To keep the nose up, I need to pull the yoke. When yoke is pulled, I felt a little hop of the plane, so I had to push the yoke at a bit to stop the plane from rising. I know in general, pushing forward of yoke is no good during landing, but I'm wondering if pushing forward of the yoke is not recommended at all.
All right. I love these types of questions because I can go 100% opinion and not feel bad at all. I love the aerodynamics that are involved with it. So the first thing I would consider, well, it's not a matter of it being right or wrong. Okay, it's going to be different for every airplane in every set of conditions. Especially, I'm thinking gusty wind could be a big factor in this scenario. So if I had posed that question, say that was a checkride question, the kinds of variables that I'd be hoping the applicant would be thinking about is, and again, this is just my opinion, the way I'm looking at it, the way I hear the question. As long as you can make the airplane do what it's supposed to do, then that's great. If you can do it smoothly, that's even better. And a soft field landing is not just about being soft. It's also about being at minimum controllable airspeed. Because you're in ground effect, that means that your indicated airspeed is well below the 1G stalling speed. So you're going to have full flaps. You're at the point of touchdown in most training airplanes, you're going to have a little bit of power. We kind of think of that as hanging it off the prop. And if the stall warning horn is calibrated correctly, the stall warning horn should be blaring as the mains gently touch down. Now, a good soft field landing can be firm, and I don't mean you slam it into the ground, but if you're really as slow as you can possibly fly and you're pulling the nose up or back pressure to the point that you almost have the yoke all the way back, or even all the way back at the moment the mains touch the ground, it's okay if it's a little firm. The key is that you're going really slow and you're holding the nose really high. Because in real life, if you're actually landing on snow or grass that hasn't been mowed in too long or something like that, the nose is going to come down. The key to protecting the airplane and doing the procedure correctly is that you were slow and had the nose high. So what I call it is drain out all of the energy. In my experience with both Pipers and Cessnas and anything else that I've done a soft field landing in, when you really drain all the energy out before the mains touch down and you have that yoke almost, or the stick, whatever it is, all the way back or almost all the way back when the mains touch down, you're not going to need to push the nose forward like you're talking about. The scenario that you shared where sometimes you touch and then the littlest movement on the yoke makes you go airborne again, that means you didn't drain all the energy out. So I would put the focus more on that than I would on what you do with the yoke after the mains touchdown. Now, that being said, if you do touch down a little bit fast and like maybe you were trying to hold the mains off, but oh, I touched, go ahead, reduce the power to idle is the first thing. As soon as those mains touch, power to idle. You should have been holding a little bit of power. And how much is a little bit? I teach enough you can hear it. So you go to idle, bring in enough you can hear it change. That's the little bit you're holding in the flare. As soon as you feel those mains touch, yank the throttle to idle while holding the nose in the same place. And I bet that'll solve the problem that you're experiencing. You're not going to have to push at all to hold it on the ground because it's done flying. You've already drained out all the energy. So, let me go ahead and go through what I teach now that I've kind of answered the question. So what I teach, and this works in any airplane I've flown, general aviation airplane, you're coming in you cross the fence, short final at the manufacturer's recommended speed, which is usually a little slower than normal speed with full flaps. Power, I like to go to idle as I cross the numbers just so I can feel and hear where idle is. Then as I go into the round out, meaning the nose comes up level with the horizon, then I bring in that little bit of power just so I can hear it. Hanging it off the prop is how I think of that. Now I'm in the flare and my whole focus is, besides center line and, you know, longitudinal axis aligned down the runway, my whole focus is drain out the energy. That's what I want you to focus on. I'm draining out the energy. I'm draining out the energy. I'm holding it 6 inches above the runway as long as possible. Stall warning horn starts blaring. A few seconds later, she's done flying. Still got a little bit of power, but I'm pulling back. I can't pull back anymore. The mains touch, power immediately goes to idle, and the yoke comes all the way to my chest if it wasn't already, and the nose comes down when it comes down. So that's how I teach it. That's how I fly it. When you're landing on pavement, that's what it's going to look like. You're going to pop a wheelie for a while before the nose comes down. So let's see. Gusty wind. I mentioned gusty wind. So you can do everything I said perfectly and get a gust of wind after the mains touch, and you're going airborne. The good news is, if you're on a check ride, the examiner can tell. Don't worry about it, okay? Just do your best to hold the back pressure, let her settle back down. Don't freak out about the fact that you just touched, went airborne, and touched again. If your technique was good, the examiner is going to be like, stupid gust of wind, you're fine, okay? I see good technique. So don't stress about that kind of stuff. Now, if you touch down too fast and it's a wimpy gust of wind that makes you go airborne, well, now we've got a pilot technique problem. You shouldn't have touched down going so fast. That's part of a soft field landing, is being at minimum controllable speed when you touch down. So that's where you need the DPE to use their judgment and experience to give you a fair grade. So, and I think those are all the variables that come to mind. Did I miss anything? So, and keep in mind, the goal here isn't necessarily just to stump the DPE, but to have a fun conversation, thinking about things we don't usually have time to talk about when we're hanging around on the flight school. So, but any other comments come in there, Russ?
No, Dylan wanted to thank you for the answer. So
That helps. Cool. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. So thank you again, everyone who attended live. And those of you who are watching this as a recording, you can go back to my YouTube channel and go all the way back to episode 1 if you want to find some more free ground instruction. Some episodes were probably more productive than others, but we're still having fun. We are scheduled for Saturday, same time. So that registration is open, FlywithJim.com. You can go register there. And if anyone's watching these way in the future after coronavirus, I'm probably not doing this anymore because I'm busy doing check rides and flight instruction and flying for my airline. So whatever episodes are up, hope you enjoy them all. And with that, thank you again, Russ, for helping to field the questions and be my co-host. And thank you again to Sonia and Greg for being here to back me up, be my wingmen, and a lot of good information today. So thank you much. We'll talk to you guys later.
thanks, Jim.
You're welcome.